The sun dipped low behind the sprawling windows of the resort conference center, casting a warm glow over the lavishly decorated room. Isaiah Morgan, a tall, dignified black man in his mid-40s, stood at the edge of the room, surveying the scene before him. His colleagues, all high-ranking executives of Vanguard Tech, mingled around the high tables, laughing and clinking glasses of champagne as they chatted about their latest accomplishments. Isaiah adjusted his tie, a faint smile on his lips, but inside, a familiar weight settled in his chest. Isaiah had worked his way to the top. Born to a single mother in the rough neighborhoods of Detroit, he had defied all odds to become one of the few black executives at one of the largest tech companies in the country. His journey had been grueling, filled with countless sleepless nights, racial microaggressions, and moments where he questioned whether he could ever truly belong in these boardrooms. But now, after decades of climbing the corporate ladder, he stood at the pinnacle of success, or so it seemed. Despite his title as Vice President of Global Strategy, Isaiah knew that, to many of his peers, he was still an outsider. The glass ceiling may have shattered, but the shards remained, sharp and dangerous beneath the surface. Tonight they were gathered to celebrate a monumental partnership deal with an international tech giant, Omicron Innovations, a deal that Isaiah had spent the last year spearheading. It was supposed to be a crowning achievement in his career, a moment of recognition for all his hard work. But even now, as he looked around the room, he felt the subtle distance between him and his colleagues. Across the room, Blake Thompson, a brash, charismatic white executive in his late 30s, held court with a group of executives. Blake was everything Isaiah was not: young, wealthy, and arrogant, with a self-assuredness that only privilege could afford. Blake's rise within the company had been meteoric, and while his charm won over many, his sharp tongue and veiled remarks about diversity initiatives often left Isaiah feeling uneasy. As Isaiah watched Blake laugh heartily with his group, Blake caught Isaiah's eye and raised his glass in mock salute. Isaiah nodded curtly, his smile tightening. Isaiah's voice called from behind him. Maya, his assistant, a young black woman in her late 20s, approached with a glass of water in hand. Her eyes sparkled with admiration, and Isaiah felt a swell of pride at the sight of her. Maya had joined the company 2 years ago, fresh out of business school, and Isaiah had taken her under his wing, mentoring her in a way he had wished someone had done for him when he was younger. "You ready for your big moment?" Maya asked, handing him the water. Isaiah chuckled, shaking his head. "As ready as I'll ever be. You know how these things go. Say a few words, smile for the cameras, and hope nobody remembers what you said by morning." Maya laughed. "I don't know about that. I think they'll be talking about you for a while after this one. You've made this deal happen, Isaiah. They have to recognize that." Isaiah's smile faltered slightly. "We'll see." He knew that in the corporate world, acknowledgement wasn't always guaranteed. There had been many times when his contributions were minimized, his ideas dismissed until someone else, a white colleague, repackaged them as their own. But he had learned long ago to pick his battles. "Are you nervous?" Maya asked, sensing his hesitation. Isaiah exhaled deeply. "Nervous isn't the right word. I've been here before, you know? Moments where I thought all my hard work would finally be recognized, only to be reminded that I'm still different." Maya nodded, her expression softening. "I get it. But you're not just different, Isaiah, you're exceptional. They can't ignore that." Isaiah gave her a grateful smile. "Thanks, Maya. That means a lot." As they spoke, the CEO, Jonathan Marks, a tall, gray-haired man with a commanding presence, stepped up to the microphone at the front of the room, signaling the beginning of the evening's formal proceedings. "Good evening, everyone," Jonathan began, his voice booming through the speakers. "Thank you all for being here tonight as we celebrate a historic partnership between Vanguard Tech and Omicron Innovations. This is a momentous occasion for our company, and we owe it to the hard work and dedication of so many of you in this room." Isaiah listened as Jonathan continued, nodding in agreement, but his mind drifted slightly. He was already preparing for the speech he would give later in the evening, a speech that would hopefully cement his role as a key player in the company's future. Jonathan's voice cut through his thoughts. "But before we get to the main event, I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone who has been instrumental in making this deal a reality. Isaiah Morgan, our VP of Global Strategy, has worked tirelessly over the past year to bring this partnership to fruition. Isaiah, would you please join me on stage?" The room erupted in polite applause as Isaiah set down his glass and made his way to the front. His heart pounded in his chest, but he maintained his calm, professional demeanor. This was his moment, and he was determined not to let anything ruin it. As he stepped onto the stage, he noticed Blake leaning against a pillar in the back of the room, a smirk on his face. Isaiah ignored him and took his place next to Jonathan. "Thank you, Jonathan," Isaiah began, his voice steady. "I'm honored to be here tonight and even more honored to have been a part of this incredible journey. The partnership between Vanguard Tech and Omicron Innovations represents a new era of innovation and global collaboration, and I'm excited to see where it will take us." He paused, scanning the room. His colleagues watched him intently, some with genuine interest, others merely waiting for the speech to end so they could get back to their conversations. But Isaiah pressed on, determined to make his mark. "Tonight isn't just about celebrating a business deal," he continued. "It's about recognizing the hard work, dedication, and collaboration that made it possible. It's about acknowledging the diversity of thought, experience, and background that drives innovation in our industry." The subtle shift in his speech caught a few eyes, and Isaiah knew he was walking a fine line. He had always been careful about how he discussed diversity in these spaces, knowing that too much emphasis could make him a target, while too little would ignore the very challenges he had faced his entire career. But before he could continue, a loud, mocking voice broke through the room. "Yeah, diversity," Blake called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We're lucky we've got those quotas filled, right, Isaiah?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Blake, who stood grinning, clearly amused by his own joke. Isaiah froze, the words dying in his throat. His heart pounded as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Blake had crossed a line, and everyone knew it, but no one moved to stop him. For a brief moment, Isaiah considered letting it slide, as he had done so many times before. He could laugh it off, make a joke in return, and move on with his speech. But something in him snapped. He couldn't do it this time. Not again. The ballroom at the Lux Springs Resort was bathed in the soft glow of chandeliers, the clinking of silverware and quiet murmur of voices filling the air as the attendees enjoyed their multi-course dinner. Waiters in white uniforms glided between the tables, pouring wine into glasses as the evening's speeches and presentations continued. At the head of the room stood Isaiah Morgan, 45, black, poised and collected in his sharp navy blue suit. His polished shoes gleamed beneath the bright lights of the podium, his commanding presence filling the room, though a small bead of sweat traced the line of his brow. The heat of the stage lights was one thing, but the weight of the moment was another. This was supposed to be Isaiah's crowning achievement, the culmination of years of relentless work and sacrifice. The strategic partnership between Vanguard Tech and Omicron Innovations was not just a business deal, it was his legacy, proof that he had transcended the boundaries so often placed on him. Tonight, his success would be acknowledged in front of his peers, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had finally earned their respect. As Isaiah spoke, delivering a speech carefully crafted to emphasize both humility and leadership, he felt a shift in the room. His words were hitting the right notes, people were nodding, and a few even whispered their approval. But just as he was about to transition into the key point about the importance of collaboration, a sharp voice cut through the air like a knife. "Yeah, diversity," Blake Thompson, 38, white, drawled from his table at the back, a smirk playing on his lips. He was leaning back in his chair, legs crossed, one arm casually slung over the back of his chair, as if he owned the room. His gray suit, though perfectly tailored, hung loosely around his relaxed frame, making his arrogance all the more pronounced. "We're lucky we've got those quotas filled, right, Isaiah?" The room fell into a thick, uncomfortable silence like the still air before a storm. Every eye turned toward Isaiah, and the energy in the room shifted from celebration to uncertainty. The chandeliers above seemed to dim as Isaiah's pulse quickened. His heart pounded in his chest, the reverberation almost deafening in the sudden quiet. Isaiah's hand gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles turning white, but he forced his face to remain impassive. For a split second, his gaze met Jonathan Marks, 55, white, the CEO, who sat stiffly at the front table. Jonathan's expression wavered between discomfort and frustration, his attempt to smile reassuringly betraying the deep awkwardness of the moment. But he said nothing. No one did. Isaiah swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the glass of water nearby. He glanced at Maya 29, black, sitting further back. She was frozen, her brown eyes wide, her lips parted slightly in shock. She was wearing her fitted black blazer and white blouse, but the sharp professionalism she usually wore as armor was melting into pure concern. The seconds felt like hours, and Isaiah knew everyone was waiting for his response, waiting to see how he would handle the insult veiled as a joke. Isaiah's mind raced, the memories of every microaggression he had swallowed over the years rushing forward like a tidal wave. He had been in rooms like this before, where comments like Blake's were brushed aside with a laugh, dismissed as just jokes or banter, but this wasn't a private conversation or a backhanded compliment in a meeting. This was public. This was humiliation in front of the people who claimed to respect him. Isaiah could feel the eyes of the room burning into him, the weight of their expectation heavy on his shoulders. Would he laugh it off? Would he make a joke in return to ease the tension, to prove that he could take it? But something inside him snapped. He couldn't laugh this off. Not this time. Forcing himself to take a deep breath, Isaiah leaned forward slightly, gripping the edge of the podium with both hands. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low but steady. "Thank you for that." Blake, Isaiah said, his tone deliberate, his eyes locked on Blake's smirking face. "It's always great to be reminded of how far we still have to go." A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the room, but the tension was palpable. Blake, his smirk faltering for just a moment, took a sip of his wine, leaning back further in his chair, feigning indifference. His pale blue eyes darted around the room, clearly basking in the attention, but Isaiah could see the smug satisfaction in his posture. Isaiah continued with his speech, but the energy had shifted. He rushed through the remainder of his remarks, his voice steady but lacking the confidence and enthusiasm he had started with. The words felt hollow, and every eye in the room was still on him, some sympathetic, others simply curious to see how the black executive would handle the thinly veiled insult. He wrapped up his speech with a polite thank you, and a round of awkward applause followed as he stepped down from the podium. His steps felt heavy, the confidence drained from him. Isaiah avoided eye contact as he made his way back to his table, his head held high, but his mind swirling with a mix of anger, shame, and disappointment. As Isaiah reached his table, Jonathan Marks stood up, giving him a brief, tight smile before patting him on the back, as if to say, "Well done, we survived that," but Isaiah couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. He wasn't sure what hurt more, Blake's words or the room's silence. In the back, Blake continued to sip his wine, clearly pleased with himself. He whispered something to the executive seated next to him, and they both chuckled, a low sound that carried across the room. Isaiah glanced at Maya, who was staring at him, her brow furrowed in concern. She gave him a small, supportive nod, but her eyes were filled with the same frustration he felt. She had witnessed the microaggressions before, had faced her own in other rooms, but to see Isaiah humiliated like this, after everything he had worked for, was different. It was personal. Isaiah sat down, staring at his untouched plate, his mind racing. The weight of the moment felt unbearable, but he couldn't let it show. Not here. Not now. He could feel the storm of emotions building inside him, but he swallowed it down. There would be time to deal with it later. For now, he had to keep his composure. The night continued, but Isaiah was barely present. The rest of the speeches and toasts blended into a blur of voices, none of which seemed to matter. His mind kept circling back to Blake's comment and the room's collective silence. He had been expecting recognition for his work, but instead he had been reduced to a quota, a stereotype used to undermine his achievements in front of everyone. As the dinner came to an end, Isaiah stood to excuse himself early. He couldn't take any more of the smiles and forced pleasantries from his colleagues. He needed air. He needed space to process what had just happened. He caught Maya's eye as he headed toward the exit. She stood up quickly and followed him, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor as she caught up with him in the hallway. "Isaiah, wait," she called softly, her voice tinged with concern. Isaiah stopped, his hands resting on the door handle, but he didn't turn around. "I'm so sorry," Maya said quietly. "That was." Isaiah finally turned to face her. "It was exactly what I expected," he said, his voice bitter. "This isn't new, Maya. It's just more public this time." Maya's eyes welled up with frustration. "You don't have to take this, Isaiah. Not anymore. Isaiah sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. I've been taking it my whole career, Maya. It's the price we pay. He pushed open the door, stepping into the cool night air. For now, he would deal with it in silence. But inside, something had shifted. Something had broken, and he knew that silence wouldn't be enough much longer. Isaiah pushed through the heavy glass doors of the conference room and found himself in the hallway of the resort, the quiet a stark contrast to the tension he had just left behind. He walked briskly toward the balcony that overlooked the resort gardens, his heart still pounding in his chest. The cool evening air hit his face as he stepped outside, but it did little to calm the storm inside him. For a moment, he simply stood there, gripping the railing and staring out at the perfectly manicured lawn below. His mind raced, replaying Blake's comment over and over again. Each time it stung a little more, each repetition hammering in the message he had been trying to ignore for years, that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how successful he became, there would always be people like Blake, people who saw him not as a leader or an equal, but as a token. Isaiah exhaled sharply, releasing some of the tension in his body, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. He had spent so long holding it in, convincing himself that he couldn't afford to react, that responding would only make him seem unprofessional, emotional, or worse, like the stereotypical angry black man. But tonight, that burden felt too heavy to carry. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He took it out and saw a message from Maya. Maya, you okay? I'm here if you need to talk. Isaiah stared at the message for a moment, debating whether to respond. He appreciated Maya's support, but he wasn't sure what to say. How could he explain the deep sense of betrayal, the humiliation, without letting the anger take over? Finally, he typed back a brief response. Isaiah, I'm fine. Just need a minute. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the night wash over him. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint murmur of the conference continuing without him. He wondered what they were saying in there. Were they discussing Blake's comment, or had they already moved on, pretending as if nothing had happened? He wouldn't be surprised if it was the latter. After all, silence was often easier than confrontation. As he stood there, his thoughts drifted back to his father, David Morgan. His father had been a civil rights activist, a man who had fought tirelessly for equality, marching in protests and organizing community movements to fight against systemic racism. David had been a larger-than-life figure in Isaiah's childhood, a man who believed in justice and wasn't afraid to speak up, no matter the cost. Isaiah had looked up to his father in awe, but there had always been a part of him that resented the constant struggle, the endless battle against a world that seemed determined to keep them down. After his father's death killed by police during a peaceful protest when Isaiah was just a boy, Isaiah had vowed to take a different path. He would succeed not by fighting the system, but by working within it, by proving his worth in boardrooms and executive offices. But now, standing on the balcony of a luxurious resort, the same feelings of helplessness and rage that had haunted him as a child came rushing back. Despite all his accomplishments, despite the prestige of his title and the respect he had earned, moments like tonight reminded him that the fight wasn't over, not for him, and not for people like him. The sound of footsteps behind him broke through his reverie. Isaiah turned to see Maya approaching, her face set in a determined expression. Isaiah, I know you said you needed a minute, she said softly, but I'm not going to let you stand out here alone after what just happened. Isaiah sighed, feeling a mixture of gratitude and frustration. Maya, I appreciate it, but I'm fine, really. Maya crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. No, you're not. And that's okay. What happened in there was. It was wrong. And you shouldn't have to deal with it alone. Isaiah leaned back against the railing, running a hand over his face. What do you want me to do, Maya? Make a scene? Call Blake out in front of everyone? Maya's expression softened. No, but you don't have to stay silent either. Isaiah chuckled bitterly. And say what? That Blake's a racist? That the only reason he feels comfortable saying those things is because no one in that room will hold him accountable. You know how that'll go. They'll make excuses for him. They'll tell me I'm being too sensitive or that I misunderstood. I've seen it happen 1,000 times. Maya took a step closer, her voice quiet but firm. I know. But what about you, Isaiah? What about what this is doing to you? How many more times are you going to let someone like Blake humiliate you before you say something? Isaiah met her gaze, and for a moment he couldn't find the words to respond. Maya was right, of course. This wasn't the first time he had been subjected to comments like Blake's, and it wouldn't be the last. But the thought of confronting it head-on, of exposing himself to more scrutiny, made his chest tighten with anxiety. "What if I can't?" Isaiah finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I say something and it makes things worse? What if I lose everything I've worked for?" Maya's eyes softened, and she reached out to place a hand on his arm. "Isaiah, you've already proven yourself, you've earned everything you have, and no one can take that away from you. But staying silent, letting people like Blake get away with this, it's not just hurting you. It's hurting everyone who looks up to you." Isaiah looked away, the weight of her words settling over him. He had spent so long trying to navigate these spaces without making waves, without drawing attention to the things that made him different. But maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe by staying quiet, by not pushing back, he was allowing the system to continue unchecked. Isaiah let out a long breath. "I don't know if I'm ready to do this, Maya." "You don't have to do it alone," she replied gently. "I'm with you. And I know there are others who will be too." For a long moment, Isaiah stood in silence, the cool night air swirling around them. He thought about the years he had spent holding back, the moments when he had bitten his tongue instead of speaking up. He thought about his father, who had never shied away from the fight, even when it cost him everything. Maybe it was time for Isaiah to stop holding back. Finally, he nodded, a sense of resolve settling in his chest. "You're right. It's time." The next morning, Isaiah arrived at the office earlier than usual. The events of the previous night still weighed heavily on his mind, but there was a new determination in his steps. He had spent the night replaying the moment in his head, thinking about all the times he had let moments like that slide. Not today. Today, things would be different. As he made his way to his office, several of his colleagues glanced at him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. The incident from the previous night had spread through the office gossip channels like wildfire, and everyone knew what had happened. Some offered polite nods, while others averted their gaze, as if unsure how to address the elephant in the room. Isaiah didn't care. He wasn't here for their sympathy. When he reached his office, Maya was already there, waiting for him. She gave him a small, encouraging smile as he stepped inside. "Ready?" she asked. Isaiah nodded, his jaw set. "Let's do this." Together, they walked to the conference room where the senior leadership team would be meeting for their weekly strategy session. As they entered, the room fell silent. Blake was already there, sitting at the far end of the table, his posture relaxed as if nothing had happened. His smug grin from the night before was gone, replaced by a look of indifference. Isaiah took his seat, his gaze fixed on Blake, who didn't meet his eyes. The CEO, Jonathan Marks, cleared his throat and began the meeting as usual, discussing quarterly earnings and upcoming projects. But Isaiah barely heard any of it. His mind was focused on the moment that was coming, the moment where he would finally speak up. When Jonathan finished his updates, Isaiah raised his hand. "Before we move on, there's something I need to address," Isaiah said, his voice steady. The room went still, and all eyes turned to him. Isaiah took a deep breath, feeling Maya's reassuring presence beside him. "Last night during the dinner, something was said that I can't ignore. Blake made a comment about diversity and quotas, and while it may have been intended as a joke, it wasn't funny, it was offensive. And it's not the first time something like this has happened." The air in the room grew tense, and Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expression tightening. "I've spent years working in this company, and I've experienced more than my share of microaggressions, veiled comments, and dismissals of my work," Isaiah continued, his voice growing stronger. "I've stayed quiet because I didn't want to cause trouble. I didn't want to be seen as the angry black man, but staying quiet isn't working. It's allowing people like Blake to think they can say whatever they want without consequence." Jonathan looked taken aback, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. "Isaiah, I'm not finished," Isaiah said, cutting him off. "I've worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let this slide anymore. And it's not just about me, It's about every person of color in this company who feels like they can't speak up because they're afraid of being dismissed or punished. That ends today. Blake finally spoke up, his voice defensive. Come on, Isaiah. It was just a joke. You're taking this way too seriously. Isaiah turned to him, his gaze unwavering. That's exactly the problem, Blake. You think it's just a joke, but it's not. It's about power. It's about you thinking you can say whatever you want because you don't see me as your equal. Blake's face flushed with anger, but he didn't respond. I'm not asking for sympathy, Isaiah said, addressing the room. I'm asking for accountability. We need to do better. This company needs to do better, and it starts with us. The room was silent, the weight of Isaiah's words hanging in the air. Jonathan looked around at his colleagues, clearly grappling with how to respond. Isaiah, Jonathan finally said, his voice measured, I hear you. And you're right, we do need to do better. I'll take immediate action to address this situation. Isaiah nodded, but he wasn't finished. It's not just about addressing one situation, Jonathan. It's about changing the culture here. If we don't do that, nothing will really change. Jonathan nodded, his expression serious. You have my word. We'll make it right. Isaiah leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had done it. He had spoken up. And while he knew this was just the beginning, it felt like a victory. The rest of the meeting felt like an eternity to Isaiah. After he had spoken, the room remained tense, each word from Jonathan and the other executives laden with the weight of what had been said. Even as they discussed the company's future strategies, the shift was palpable. Isaiah could see the discomfort in their faces, especially in Blake's. The arrogant smirk that had been so prominent the night before was replaced with something else, perhaps embarrassment, perhaps fear. Isaiah's words had struck a nerve, not just with Blake, but with everyone in that room. For too long, they had lived in a bubble of privilege, assuming that their actions, whether intentional or not, had no real consequences. Isaiah had just shattered that illusion, and now they were all grappling with the reality of what their culture had allowed to fester. As the meeting adjourned, Jonathan caught Isaiah's eye, giving him a slight nod of acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but Isaiah appreciated it. For years, he had worked under Jonathan, respecting him as a leader, but always feeling that his concerns, his identity, had been a blind spot for the CEO. Today, that dynamic had changed. Maya lingered by Isaiah's side as they left the conference room. You were incredible, she said, her voice quiet but full of admiration. I'm so proud of you. Isaiah smiled, though the tension in his chest hadn't fully dissipated. Thanks, Maya. I just hope it leads to real change. She nodded. It will. It has to. Isaiah wasn't so sure. He had been in corporate environments long enough to know that promises of change were easy to make but much harder to execute. But at least now the conversation was happening. That was more than he had been able to say before. As they walked toward his office, Blake caught up with them, his expression a mix of irritation and forced calm. Isaiah, can I have a word? Blake asked, his tone clipped. Isaiah tensed, feeling the presence of Maya beside him like a protective shield. He could already sense where this conversation was going, but he nodded, gesturing for Blake to follow him into his office. Inside, Isaiah closed the door behind them. Blake remained standing near the desk, his arms crossed defensively. I wanted to talk about what happened in the meeting, Blake began, his voice tight. I think we both know this has gotten way out of hand. Isaiah raised an eyebrow, leaning against the edge of his desk. Out of hand? Blake, you made a comment last night that was offensive. You might not realize it, but it was, and I had every right to call it out. Blake huffed in frustration, shaking his head. Look, man, I was just messing around. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously. I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of it. Isaiah felt the familiar anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay calm. It's a big deal, Blake, because it wasn't just a joke. It's part of a larger issue that I and many others have had to deal with our whole lives. You might not understand it because it doesn't affect you, but that doesn't make it any less real. Blake's jaw tightened. You're really going to turn this into a race thing? Isaiah blinked in disbelief. Blake, it is a race thing. That's the whole point. What you said wasn't just about me as an individual. It was about me as a black man in this company, in this society. You can't separate the two. Blake shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting Isaiah to push back this hard. I didn't mean it like that, he muttered, his voice quieter now. I didn't think it would hit you like that. Isaiah softened slightly, recognizing that Blake was struggling to understand. I know you probably didn't. But that's part of the problem. You didn't think. You didn't consider how your words might affect me or anyone else. That's what needs to change. Blake was silent for a moment, his gaze shifting to the floor. When he spoke again, his voice was more subdued. So what now? You want me to apologize in front of everyone? Admit I'm a racist. Isaiah sighed. This isn't about labeling anyone. It's about recognizing the impact of what you said and doing better in the future. If you can acknowledge that, then maybe we can move forward. Blake frowned, clearly still uncomfortable, but after a long pause, he nodded. Fine, I'll own up to it. I didn't mean to hurt you, Isaiah. I'll apologize to the team. Isaiah nodded, appreciating the gesture, though he knew it was just the beginning. Good. That's a start. Blake hesitated for a moment longer, then gave a curt nod before turning and leaving the office. As the door closed behind him, Isaiah let out a long breath, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over him. He wasn't sure if Blake's apology would be sincere or if it would lead to any real change, but at least it was something. Maya stepped into the office shortly after Blake left, her expression one of cautious optimism. How did it go? Isaiah rubbed his temples, feeling the exhaustion creep in. It went as well as it could, I guess. He said he'd apologize. Maya nodded, though her face showed the same doubt that Isaiah felt. Do you think he'll mean it? Isaiah shrugged. I don't know. But at this point, I'm less concerned about Blake and more concerned about the bigger picture. Maya's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Isaiah sat down at his desk, his gaze distant. I've been thinking a lot about my place in this company, about what I want to do moving forward. And I'm not sure if this is it anymore. Maya's eyes widened in surprise. You're not thinking about leaving, are you? Isaiah hesitated, weighing his words carefully. I don't know yet, but I can't ignore the feeling that I've outgrown this place. That maybe it's time to focus on something bigger. Maya looked at him, her expression filled with concern and understanding. I get it. But Isaiah, you've worked so hard to get here. You've made such an impact. Isaiah smiled faintly. I know. And that's part of why I'm thinking about leaving. Maybe I can make an even bigger impact somewhere else. The next few days were tense at Vanguard Tech. Blake did issue a public apology to the executive team, though it was clear to everyone that it was more out of obligation than genuine remorse. Still, it was enough to diffuse the immediate tension, and the company began to move forward with promises of diversity training and corporate reforms. Yet to Isaiah, it felt like putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound. As the days passed, Isaiah's conversations with Jonathan became more pointed. Jonathan knew that losing Isaiah would be a blow to the company, not only because of his expertise but because of the statement it would make about Vanguard's culture. Jonathan did his best to convince Isaiah to stay, offering promotions, more autonomy, and even the possibility of leading diversity initiatives within the company. But for Isaiah, the decision had already been made. One evening, as Isaiah sat in his office reviewing the final terms of the deal with Omicron Innovations, he received an unexpected email. It was from James Parker, the CEO of RiseUp, a non-profit organization that focused on mentoring young Black professionals and providing them with the tools to navigate the corporate world. Isaiah had worked with James briefly years ago when RiseUp was still in its infancy, and now the organization had grown into a national powerhouse for diversity and inclusion efforts. James, Isaiah, I've been following your work at Vanguard, and I wanted to reach out. We've got some big initiatives coming up, and I think you'd be the perfect person to lead them. Would love to chat about what's next for you. Let me know if you're interested. Isaiah stared at the email for a long moment, his mind swirling with possibilities. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he had been thinking about, an opportunity to make a real difference, to mentor young professionals like Maya and help them avoid the struggles he had faced. The corporate world had been his battlefield for so long, but maybe now it was time to step into a different kind of role, one where he could create systemic change from the outside. He quickly typed a reply, agreeing to a meeting, and hit send. As the message disappeared from his screen, Isaiah felt a sense of clarity wash over him. For the first time in a long while, he knew exactly what his next move would be. 2 weeks later, Isaiah stood at the front of a packed conference room, a microphone in hand. The room was filled with young black professionals, many of them recent graduates, all eager to learn from those who had walked the path before them. This was the annual Rise Up Leadership Summit, and Isaiah had been invited as the keynote speaker. As he looked out at the sea of faces, he felt a profound sense of purpose. These young people were where he had been years ago, hungry for success, determined to prove themselves in a world that wasn't built for them. And now it was his turn to guide them. Isaiah began to speak, his voice steady and sure. "I'm here today because I believe in the power of resilience. I believe in the power of knowing your worth, even when others try to tell you otherwise. I've spent my career fighting to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected in rooms where I was often the only one who looked like me. And I'm here to tell you that you don't have to do it alone." He paused, scanning the room, meeting the eyes of each young professional in the audience. "You are not just filling a quota. You are not here because of your skin color. You are here because you are exceptional. And don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." The crowd erupted into applause, and Isaiah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had found his place not in the boardrooms of a tech giant, but here, in spaces where he could uplift and empower the next generation. As the applause died down, Isaiah closed his speech with a final message. "I spent too many years thinking that staying quiet would make things easier. But the truth is, silence is complicity, and change only happens when we speak up, when we stand together, and when we demand more." The audience rose to their feet, their applause thundering through the room. Isaiah smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. This was his new beginning. Later that evening, as Isaiah mingled with attendees, he received a message on his phone. It was from Blake. "Blake, I watched your speech online. I get it now. I'm sorry." Isaiah read the message, his emotions conflicted. He had moved on, but it was clear that Blake was still grappling with the impact of his actions. Isaiah wasn't sure if he could forgive Blake, but he appreciated the attempt at redemption. He typed a brief response. "Isaiah, thank you." And with that, he put the phone away, ready to continue his journey towards something greater. Isaiah stepped out of the Rise Up Leadership Summit feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The summit had been an overwhelming success, and Isaiah had seen firsthand how his words resonated with the next generation of black professionals. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of making a tangible impact beyond corporate profits and balance sheets. As he walked back to his car, the evening air cooling his skin, Isaiah's phone buzzed again. This time it was Jonathan Marks, the CEO of Vanguard Tech. "Jonathan, Isaiah, we need to talk. Please give me a call when you have a moment." Isaiah paused, standing next to his car as he read the message. He had expected this. Since submitting his resignation 2 weeks ago, Jonathan had been persistent in reaching out, trying to convince him to reconsider. Isaiah had remained firm in his decision, knowing that his time at Vanguard had come to an end, but the upcoming phone call felt like a final chapter that still needed closure. He slid into the driver's seat and dialed Jonathan's number. Jonathan's voice greeted him, a mixture of warmth and urgency. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know," Isaiah replied, his tone measured. "I've been busy." Jonathan sighed. "Look, I understand why you made the decision to leave, but I wanted to ask you to reconsider. The board has taken your concerns seriously. We're implementing changes, real changes, diversity training, a review of our hiring practices, everything you talked about. But we need your leadership. Isaiah, we need you to be part of this." Isaiah listened, letting Jonathan's words wash over him. There had been a time when those promises would have meant something, when he would have felt a glimmer of hope that real change was coming. But now it all felt too late, too little, too late. "I appreciate that," Jonathan, Isaiah said, "but I've made my decision. My focus is elsewhere now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Isaiah could sense Jonathan grappling with the reality of losing him. "I understand," Jonathan said, finally, his voice subdued. "I just want you to know that if you ever change your mind, there will always be a place for you here." Isaiah smiled faintly, appreciating the sentiment. Thank you, Jonathan. But I think it's time for me to move on. They exchanged a few more pleasantries before ending the call, and as Isaiah hung up, he felt a wave of relief. The chapter with Vanguard was officially closed, and for the first time in years, Isaiah felt free. Back at Vanguard Tech, the atmosphere was different. The incident between Isaiah and Blake had ignited discussions that had long been avoided. Employees from marginalized backgrounds, those who had previously stayed silent, began speaking out about their experiences with microaggressions and racial bias within the company. What had once been whispered in private was now being discussed openly, and the company could no longer ignore the systemic issues at play. Blake's apology, while public, had not gone unnoticed by the rest of the staff. Many saw it as insincere, a half-hearted attempt to save face after being called out in front of the executive team. Others were relieved that at least some form of accountability had been taken, but the tension within the company lingered. The incident had left a scar, one that wouldn't easily heal. For his part, Blake remained distant. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. He had been put on temporary leave following the public apology, and though he had sent a private message to Isaiah, apologizing once more, the damage had been done. The leadership team at Vanguard Tech, led by Jonathan, scrambled to implement the changes Isaiah had called for. Diversity consultants were brought in, and mandatory training sessions were scheduled for every employee, from the entry-level staff to the board of directors. It was a step in the right direction, but the road ahead was long and complicated. Maya, still working closely with the leadership team, found herself in an interesting position. With Isaiah gone, many employees, especially the younger, Black professionals, looked to her for guidance. She had always been outspoken about the need for change, and now her voice was louder than ever. One afternoon, Maya sat in her office, reviewing a report on the company's diversity initiatives when her phone rang. It was Isaiah. "Hey boss," she said, smiling as she answered the call. "Maya, how's it going?" Isaiah's voice was warm, though slightly more relaxed than usual. "It's complicated," she replied, leaning back in her chair. "The changes are happening, but it's slow. People are still adjusting." Isaiah chuckled softly. "I figured as much. Real change takes time." Maya hesitated for a moment before asking, "Do you ever regret leaving?" There was a brief pause on the other end. "No," Isaiah said finally. "I don't. It was the right decision for me, but I do miss working with you." Maya smiled. "Same here. It's not the same without you." They chatted for a while longer, discussing the latest company gossip and Isaiah's new role at RiseUp. As they spoke, Maya realized just how much Isaiah's departure had impacted the company and how much his presence was still felt. When they finally hung up, Maya sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on how much had changed. Isaiah had left, but his legacy remained. The fight for equity and justice was far from over, but Maya knew she wasn't alone in continuing that work. Isaiah had paved the way, and now it was up to people like her to keep pushing forward. Meanwhile, Isaiah's new life at RiseUp had taken off with incredible momentum. The organization was growing rapidly, and Isaiah had been given the opportunity to lead several key initiatives aimed at helping young Black professionals navigate corporate America. His work had become a lifeline for those who felt like they were fighting an uphill battle, and Isaiah relished the chance to make a real difference in their lives. He spent his days mentoring, speaking at events, and advocating for systemic change in the corporate world. It was demanding work, but it was also fulfilling in a way that Isaiah hadn't experienced before. For the first time in years, he felt like he was in the right place, doing the right thing. One afternoon, Isaiah was in his office at RiseUp when he received a call from James Parker, the CEO. "Isaiah, I've got great news," James said, his voice brimming with excitement. "We just secured a major partnership with the National Black Professional Network, and I want you to lead the initiative." Isaiah's eyes widened in surprise. The National Black Professional Network was one of the largest organizations of its kind, with a massive reach across the country. Leading this partnership would be a game changer, not just for RiseUp, but for Isaiah personally. "That's incredible," Isaiah said, a smile spreading across his face. "I'd be honored to take it on." James laughed. "I knew you'd say that. We're going to change the game with this one, Isaiah. I can feel it." As the call ended, Isaiah leaned back in his chair, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He had found his purpose, and it was bigger than anything he could have imagined during his time at Vanguard. But it wasn't just about the partnerships or the initiatives. It was about the people. The young professionals he mentored, the lives he touched. This was what truly mattered. Months passed, and Isaiah continued to thrive in his new role at RiseUp. He traveled across the country, speaking at conferences, leading workshops, and mentoring the next generation of Black professionals. His work had become a beacon of hope for those who felt isolated in their corporate environments, and Isaiah had embraced his role as a leader in the fight for equity and justice. One evening, Isaiah was invited to speak at a major corporate event in New York City. The event, hosted by the National Black Professional Network, brought together some of the most influential Black leaders in the country. It was a night of celebration and reflection, honoring those who had paved the way for future generations. As Isaiah stepped onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. He took a moment to soak it all in, the bright lights, the sea of faces looking up at him with admiration. It was a far cry from the boardrooms of Vanguard Tech, where he had once felt so out of place. Now he was exactly where he belonged. Good evening," Isaiah began, his voice steady and confident. "It's an honor to be here tonight, among so many incredible leaders and trailblazers." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I stand here today because of those who came before me, those who fought for justice and equity, even when the odds were stacked against them. People like my father who never gave up, even when the world told him to stay silent. And it's because of them that I refuse to stay silent." The room was silent, hanging on to his every word. "We've come a long way." Isaiah continued, "But the fight isn't over. There are still boardrooms where our voices aren't heard. There are still companies where diversity is treated as an afterthought, rather than a priority. And there are still people who believe that our success is the result of quotas, rather than hard work and talent." His voice grew stronger. "But we are here to change that. We are here to create a world where Black excellence is celebrated, not questioned, where our worth is recognized, not diminished, and where the next generation of Black leaders can rise without fear of being silenced." The crowd erupted into applause, and Isaiah felt a surge of emotion. This was why he had left Vanguard. This was why he had chosen to speak out, to break the silence. Because it wasn't just about him, it was about all of them. As the applause died down, Isaiah closed his speech with a powerful message. "Tonight, I want you to remember this: we are not just survivors of the system. We are the architects of a new one, and together we will build something greater than any of us could have imagined." The audience rose to their feet, the applause deafening. Isaiah stood there, humbled and proud, knowing that he had found his true calling. He had spent years fighting for a seat at the table, but now he was building a new one, a table where everyone had a place. Later that evening, as Isaiah mingled with the crowd, he was approached by a familiar face. Blake Thompson, the very man who had humiliated him months earlier, stood before him, looking nervous and out of place. Isaiah Blake began, his voice hesitant. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I know I've said it before, but after everything I've seen since you left, I understand now. I didn't get it then, but I do now." Isaiah studied Blake for a moment, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes. It had taken time, but it seemed that Blake had finally come to terms with the harm he had caused. "I appreciate that," Blake, Isaiah said calmly. "I really do." Blake nodded, clearly relieved. "I've been working on myself, trying to understand how my actions affected you and others. I hope we can move forward." Isaiah smiled faintly, though he knew that forgiveness was a journey, not a destination. "It's a process, Blake, but I'm glad you're doing the work." Blake gave a small smile before excusing himself, leaving Isaiah alone with his thoughts. As Isaiah stood there, watching the people around him, young professionals, seasoned leaders, allies in the fight for equity, he felt a deep sense of peace. His journey had been long and difficult, filled with moments of doubt and pain, but in the end it had led him here. And here was exactly where he was meant to be.